Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to be talking about audiobooks, and specifically asking the question, do I like audiobooks more than I like physical books? So, the other day someone left me a comment on this channel asking whether I'd ever enjoyed a book more on audiobook than I had enjoyed it physically. And the answer is definitely yes, like such an automatic yes, that it made me think about whether I might in fact like listening to audiobooks more than I like reading physical books, or at least whether there is a slightly higher chance that I will enjoy a book I listen to more than a book that I read physically. And I don't necessarily think I do like listening to audiobooks more than I like reading physical books. I feel like this is a mildly clickbaity question. I mean, it's not that clickbaity, is it? Does anyone care? I'm gonna have a chat today about audiobooks. I have various things I want to talk about. I have lots of notes, so I'm sorry if I keep looking down at my laptop. But I had lots of thoughts about this topic, so I thought it would be hopefully interesting to discuss. This is probably going to be one of these rambly, long videos where I talk about lots of things, and then I will have some audiobook recommendations, like more specifically later on in the video. But anyway, one thing I'm not going to do today is like have a long chat about whether listening to audiobooks counts as reading. Like, as far as I'm concerned, of course it does. There's not a doubt in my mind that listening to audiobooks counts as reading. If you've listened to a book on audiobook, you know, like a full unabridged reading of the book, not like a radio adaptation thing, but like an actual audiobook, if you have listened to an audiobook of a book, then you have read that book. Of course you have. But obviously listening to an audiobook is a slightly different experience to reading a book physically. And it's a bigger difference, say, than the difference between reading a book in paperback and reading a book on ebook. There is a bigger difference between reading a book physically and listening to a book on audiobook. Although I feel like how big that difference is probably does depend slightly on how your mind works and how you read. I made a video last year, I think it was last year, but maybe it was the year before, about subvocalization. If you don't know what subvocalization is, it is when you sound out every word in your mind as you read. So while you're reading physically, you are speaking the words in your brain. And that's how I read. I subvocalize as I read, which means as I'm reading physically, I hear every single word aloud in my head, and like I do voices in my mind for the characters. So when I read physically, there is like an audiobook going on in my head that I have created with my mind, and that's how my mind works when I read. So when I read physically, I'm kind of listening to my own personal audiobook in my brain. So therefore, I feel like the difference between reading physically and listening to an audiobook for me is not that big. Like, sometimes I forget whether I read a book physically or listened to an audiobook. Whereas I feel like if you don't subvocalize, maybe the gap between reading physically and listening to an audiobook feels wider. I do wonder, because obviously not all people get on with audiobooks, which is perfectly fair, but I do wonder whether if you subvocalize, you like audiobooks more. I need to do a poll and find out. I should have done that before making this video, but anyway, I'll put up a poll after this video just out of interest. Maybe there's no correlation at all and that's just me, but anyway. There is, I would say, when you're listening to an audiobook, like a degree of interpretation within an audiobook. Like, an audiobook narrator gives emphasis and tone that is guided by the novel itself, but, you know, sometimes can reflect their own interpretation, or maybe the interpretation of the director. Like, usually when an audiobook is recorded, there is the audiobook narrator, and then there is someone who is directing and editing the audiobook, sitting in the booth next door. I've been to a few audiobook recordings, partly because I work in publishing as an editor, so I've like accompanied authors to listen to their audiobooks being recorded, and I'm also an author myself, and I have gone along to hear bits of my audiobooks being recorded. During an audiobook recording, the narrator, the reader, will be reading it, and sometimes the director will say, oh, say that line again, or oh, you've got the emphasis wrong, or say that quieter because it's meant to be whispered, or whatever. And I can think of at least one, but kind of only one, book that I have read physically and listened to an audiobook where I am aware of a tone choice in the audiobook that slightly changes things. So for example, I love Rosamund Pike's audiobook of Pride and Prejudice. I think it's a fantastic audiobook. I've listened to it so many times. Like, I've probably read Pride and Prejudice 12 times, and like 6 or 7 of those times were listening to the Rosamund Pike audiobook. I love it. I listen to it a lot. However, the way she reads Charlotte Lucas's dialogue, I think she makes Charlotte Lucas like sound a bit bitter, and I don't think Charlotte Lucas is bitter. That's not my reading of the character, but that is Rosamund Pike's reading of the character. So if you have only listened to the Rosamund Pike audiobook of Pride and Prejudice and you haven't read it physically or listened to a different audiobook, would you like Charlotte Lucas less? Possibly, but it's very minor, and literally that's the only audiobook I can think of. There's lots of books that I've read both physically and on audio, and that's the only example I can think of where I slightly disagree with a voice characterization thing, and I still love that audiobook a lot. And certainly, like, as an author myself, I've written 2 books, if you don't know, The Secrets of Owen Teale and The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hearst, both historical fiction, and I've listened to the audiobooks of them both in full, and I love the audiobooks, narrated by Olivia Vinall. She's fantastic, and I feel like the audiobooks of my books are a perfect interpretation of my work. Like, I feel like Olivia Vinall totally understood the books and totally understands the characters, and she reads them with the emphasis that I would give them, basically. Like, when I've listened to the audiobooks, it's just kind of how it is in my head. So maybe that's an interesting perspective to have as well. I was watching a booktube video lately in which someone spoke about listening to an audiobook being a bit like reading a book in translation. Like, you've read the book, of course you have. No one's going to say that you haven't read, like, The Count of Monte Cristo because you read it in English rather than French. No one's going to tell me that I haven't read a lot of books by Minami Yoshimoto because I read them in English rather than in Japanese. If you've read a translated work, you've read the book, but there is a degree of interpretation present within the version that you're reading because it went through a translator's hands. Their interpretation of the text is present there. And I think that is kind of true with an audiobook as well. I feel like the interpretation in an audiobook is a much smaller presence than in a translation, but I don't speak another language well enough to know that, so maybe I'm wrong. But my instinct would be that reading a book in translation has like a bigger element of interpretation from the translator in it than listening to an audiobook has an element of interpretation from the narrator, if that makes sense. Anyway, all of that is to say that listening to an audiobook counts as reading. If you listen to an audiobook of a book, you have read that book, but there is a difference in experience between listening to a book and reading it physically. So let's return to the question, do I like audiobooks more than I like physical books? I think I love both a lot, and I also use both in quite different ways. Like, for me, physical books and audiobooks have different roles in my life and in my reading. If I have time to sit down and relax, I read a physical book. I would never just sit there and listen to an audiobook. I think I would get bored. Like, I wouldn't find it satisfying to just sit down and listen to an audiobook and like not be moving. Whereas reading a physical book, you're turning the pages, and certainly I read like with a bookmark as a reading guide. That helps my eyes focus. So therefore I'm always like moving when I'm reading, even if I'm just like moving a bookmark down the page. So if I have time to dedicate just to reading, then I will sit down and read a physical book. I wouldn't just sit down and listen to an audiobook. I listen to audiobooks while I'm doing other things. So I listen to audiobooks while I'm exercising or cooking or doing housework or playing video games or doing puzzles or walking or driving or on the bus. I get motion sickness, so I cannot read on a bus. Trains, usually okay to read on. Planes, sometimes okay, but not always. Buses, always bad. So if I'm on the bus, I'm listening to an audiobook. I also listen to audiobooks like if I'm ill. I feel like some people, when they're unwell, they watch TV or whatever, but I lie there and listen to audiobooks. I did lots of redecorating recently and stripped lots of wallpaper and painted lots of walls, and I got through so many audiobooks while doing that, and it was really, really nice. I also listen to audiobooks with my husband Nick, especially when we're on holiday or traveling or anything like that. We listen to audiobooks together, and that makes reading sociable, which is really nice. We have been working our way through Agatha Christie's Poirot together, and I think we're on book 25 now, and we've listened to them all together on audiobook, which has been really nice. So I feel like audiobooks are much more versatile than a physical book. Like, a physical book, you can sit down and read that physical book, and that is how you read. And I do take a book like out with me, so I do read on the train, and I do read like if I'm waiting for something, but usually if I'm reading a physical book, I'm sitting down in my house reading it, whereas audiobooks, I can listen to them while doing so many other things, which is very, very beneficial and something I really, really love. Partly because it means I can spend a lot more time reading than I would otherwise, but also because it really alleviates the boredom of like things that I otherwise don't find that exciting. You know, I like cooking and baking a lot, but I don't like to cook or bake in silence. I would rather be listening to an audiobook. I would get so bored doing exercise without listening to an audiobook, and especially I have a like long-term knee injury, so I do a lot of like physio exercises and a lot of like repetitive exercises, and I'm trying to spend a lot more time exercising because I know that helps with my injury. And I would really lose patience spending like the amount of time I do on exercise if it weren't for the fact that I could listen to audiobooks and read as I do it. I would have found redecorating like so dull without audiobooks to listen to. So audiobooks are like really important to me for that, I would say. However, I do also love the physical act of sitting down and reading physically, and especially like how relaxing it is. Like for me, it's so relaxing to just sit down and read a book. That is like my main way that I relax, I suppose. And audiobooks aren't relaxing in the same way because I'm usually listening to an audiobook while I'm doing something else that isn't inherently relaxing, like exercise. But listening to audiobooks while exercising makes exercising more relaxing. And I do sometimes listen to audiobooks while doing relaxing things like doing a puzzle or playing a like video game that isn't story-based. But in general, I would say if I'm like my main time listening to audiobooks tends to be like exercising or like cooking or housework. So it's not things that are that relaxing, but audiobooks makes them more relaxing, but it's still like a lot less relaxing than just like sitting down and reading a book physically. However, having said that I find reading physically really relaxing, there is one thing about reading physically that isn't relaxing for me, and that is that my day job also involves a lot of physical reading. So I work as an editor, I'm a freelance editor, and so I spend most of my working day reading physical text. I spend all day looking at words on a screen and editing them. So sometimes it is really nice to listen to an audiobook, and that feels like much further away from my work than reading a physical book does. And I think this is especially the case when I'm working on like a proofread or a copy edit. If I am doing a structural edit or a line edit, I find it much easier to like close that at the end of the day and sit down and read a physical book, because it's just a slightly different like part of my brain. But if I have been proofreading or copy editing all day and I then sit down and open a published book to read it for fun, I start spotting mistakes, and I will spot commas in the wrong place, and I'll start like fact checking things in my mind, and I'll start like repunctuating the sentences, and it's much harder to like get out of editing mode. And you know, some published books are really well copy edited and proofread, but there are lots of books that get published that aren't proofread and copy edited to as high a standard as I would hold myself to when working, and therefore I do often read books and think there are so many mistakes and I want to proofread it, and obviously that's not what I want to be doing for fun. You know, there has been one occasion at least where I had to switch from reading a physical book to listening to that book on audiobook because it was so poorly copy edited and there were so many mistakes and it was really bothering me, despite the fact I really enjoyed the plot. Whereas when I listen to an audiobook, I'm never in editing mode, because it's just a different thing. I'm never in the editing mindset when I listen to audiobooks, and that is something that I really love about listening to an audiobook, especially if I'm working on a proofread or a copy edit or something like that. It's really nice to listen to an audiobook and do my reading that way because it just feels much further away from my work. The other thing I wanted to have a quick look through is kind of my stats in terms of audiobooks. So I listened to a lot of audiobooks. Last year in 2024, I read 156 books, and 56 of them were books I listened to on audiobook. So that's like 36%, just over a third of my reading. And so far in 2025, I've read 90 books, and 32 of them have been audiobooks, which is again a very steady 36%. So just over a third of my reading is on audiobook. I also reread quite a lot on audiobook. So of the 56 books I read last year on audiobook, 23 of them were rereads, and of the 32 I've read so far this year on audiobook, 7 of them have been rereads. And I really like rereading on audiobook. So I pulled out those stats partly because I wanted to see whether audiobooks were like overrepresented in my favorite books of the year, because I had in my head that they would be, but they weren't. So that's not the answer I was expecting. It's not as helpful a stat as I was hoping for this video. So of the 48 books I featured across my two like favorite books of the year video in 2024, 15 of them were books I listened to on audiobook, which is like 31%, so pretty similar. I was expecting it to be more. I had in my head that more of my favorite books had been audiobooks. I don't know why I had that in my head. I suppose maybe I just like feel instinctively that I'm slightly more likely to enjoy a book if I've listened to it than if I've read it physically. I did, however, look at my stats from this year, and like I keep a spreadsheet and I like mark whether a book is a favourite. And they won't all end up in my favourite books of the year, but I guess this is basically like the books I would rate 5 stars. And out of the 41 books so far this year that I've like said, oh yes, these are probably a favourite, 19 of them were audiobooks listened. So that's like 46%, nearly half of my favourites of the year so far. So maybe that's why I had that in my head. Maybe this year has been a year of great audiobooks. And certainly my 2 favourite books so far this year, The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall and Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon, were both books I listened to on audiobook. And I loved them so much. And I do think that I am slightly more likely to like a book if I listen to it on audiobook. Or maybe it would be more accurate to say I'm less likely to dislike a book if I listen to it on audiobook. Because I think when I'm listening to an audiobook, there are a few things I just have more patience with. Like I think I have more patience with non-fiction, which I sometimes really enjoy reading physically and on audiobook, but sometimes I don't find as gripping and exciting as fiction. And I feel like when I'm listening to non-fiction on audiobook, I have more patience with it. And the same I think is true of like plotless literary fiction or literary fiction that does experimental things with punctuation that I, as a copy editor, don't approve of. I feel like I have much more patience with that on audiobook because you don't notice the punctuation. That poor audiobook narrator has to work out where to put the commas that the author didn't want to put in. Sorry, I have very strong feelings about punctuation, but anyway, I also think I have more patience with long books on audiobook, which I think is probably the opposite for some people, because you know, a book that is like 45 hours on audiobook is not going to take me 45 hours to read physically, because I read faster than I listen. I do speed up audiobooks slightly. I usually listen to audiobooks on like 1.2 or 1.3 speed, depending on how fast the narrator talks. But that audiobook is still like spoken slower than I would read. You know, a book that is like 9 hours on audiobook, I reckon I would read that in like 5 or 6 hours. I don't think I've ever like timed that exactly, but maybe I should. Maybe that'd be interesting. Anyway, I feel like I have more patience with a long book on audiobook because if I'm listening to something on audiobook, I'm also reading lots of things physically at the same time. And also my physical TBR is much bigger than my audiobook TBR. So I think I feel like less stressed and daunted by a really long audiobook because I just have like fewer audiobooks that are vying for my attention, as it were. And I guess with all of those three kind of categories, like non-fiction, less plot driven literary fiction, and sort of very long books, if I'm listening to something on audiobook and I'm doing something else physically at the same time, you know, exercise or decorating or housework or cooking or whatever, like I'm just less likely to get bored because I'm doing two things at the same time, even if the other thing I'm doing doesn't require like much brain power. I'm still doing something else at the same time. You know, I read The Mysteries of Udolpho in July, and I listened to it on audiobook while decorating, and I really enjoyed it, but it is a relatively long book. I felt the pacing wasn't perfect, but I still really, really enjoyed it because I was doing other things while listening to it. I think if I'd read it physically, I would have found that pacing element more frustrating. And when it comes to sort of less accessible literary fiction, you know, when I read Golden Hill by Frances Barber a few months ago, I was really struggling with it. To be honest, I probably should have just DNF'd it, but I was doing it for my Patreon book club and I wanted to get to the end, and most of us didn't like it that much, so we had quite a lot of good chat about it. But anyway, I switched halfway through from the physical book to the audiobook because I was so struggling with the writing style. And listening to it on audiobook, I still didn't like the book, but I did find it easier to get through. And I did find that having a narrator interpret Frances Bufford's unusual sentence structure definitely helped a lot with that. And I can think of books like The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry, which I read physically earlier this year. I think I would have liked that a lot more had I listened to it on audiobook, because one of the things I really struggled with was his sentence structure and his complete lack of punctuation. As I said, as a copy editor, I feel very strongly about punctuation, and I really struggle with The Heart in Winter. Like, I really struggle to make sense of the sentences in there because they didn't have the punctuation that grammatically was needed. And I know it was a stylistic choice, but I didn't like the stylistic choice. And if I had listened to that on audiobook, I wouldn't have noticed, would I? There are probably books I've listened to on audiobook that I loved, that if I read them physically, I would be like, where are the commas? This is such a rambly video, I'm sorry. We're going to be here a long time. Anyway, when it comes to sort of specific books and whether I've enjoyed them more on audiobook or physically, it's hard to tell with books that I have only listened to on audiobook. But there are a lot of books that I have reread on audiobook, so I've read them first physically and then I listened to them on audiobook later. There are a lot of books like that, a lot of classics especially like that, and so with them I do have a clearer sense of whether I've enjoyed them more physically or on audiobook. So for example, I have read all of Jane Austen's novels and all of Charles Dickens' novels both physically and on audiobook, and a lot of my other favourite classics, you know, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, A Small House at Allington, quite a few Thomas Hardy books. I've read them physically the first time and then I have since listened to them on audiobook. I'm currently taking part in Jen the Librarian's Thomas Hardy Readaong, reading all of Thomas Hardy's books in publication order, and so far I've been listening to them all on audiobook. I'm really enjoying that, and I'm hoping that I will be able to get audiobooks of all of them. Maybe some of the lesser well-known books might be harder to find an audiobook of, but if I can, I'm going to listen to them all. I'm really enjoying that. I love to reread on audiobook because it's a really nice way of getting a slightly different reading experience from your first read. You know, if your first read is physical and your second read is audiobook, you just have a slightly different reading experience and it gives you a slightly new perspective on the book, and I really like that. And I also find it much easier to like slot in a reread to my reading on audiobook, partly, as I said, you know, my audiobook TBR is just less long than my physical TBR, and I suppose I feel that my physical reading time is just more limited than my audiobook time. I don't know if that's actually true. As I said, audiobook reading takes up like a third of my reading in terms of books read, but because I am listening to books slower than I read them, I wonder if I actually spend more hours listening to audiobooks than I do reading physically. I probably do. I would be interested actually to calculate that. I should calculate that some month. I should like time how many hours I spend reading physically versus how many hours I listen to audiobooks. But I probably do actually spend more time listening to audiobooks. And because my audiobook time is like doing other stuff, while I'm listening to audiobooks, I just feel like my audiobook time is less precious. And therefore I feel that it's easier to reread stuff during my audiobook time, whereas I feel like my physical reading time feels more like precious and I need to save it for like things that I feel I must read now, whereas rereads I feel like will always be there. Does that make any sense? I don't know. Kind of related to that, because my audiobook TBR is less long, I feel like I'm slightly more likely to take a chance on something random on audiobook. Like I get a lot of audiobooks from my library, so I often try random things, genres that I don't read as much, things that are slightly more outside my comfort zone. You know, if someone recommends a book to me, I usually don't go out and buy it, but I usually check the Libby app and see if my library has it. And if it has it on audiobook, I add it to my audiobook library TBR, or I just get it out and borrow it and listen to it next. So I feel like my audiobook listening is less predictable. And sometimes that works out well and is kind of pleasantly surprising, I suppose. I also love reading 19th century literature on audiobook, both rereading 19th century books that I've read before, but also reading books for the first time. 19th century literature just works so well on audiobook. Partly I think because a lot of 19th century authors wrote their books expecting people to read them aloud. This was a massive thing in the 19th century, you know, partly because literacy rates were lower, so people who could read read literature aloud to people who couldn't. Because also in the days before TV and, I was about to say radio, does anyone listen to the radio anymore? In the days before TV and Spotify and YouTube, people made their own entertainment. So your kind of evening family entertainment would be if someone in your family could play an instrument and you had an instrument, they might play that, or someone would read aloud to everyone else. That was a really common thing to do in the 19th century. Someone would read aloud to the rest of the family. So 19th century authors wrote their books expecting people to read them aloud, and so they often work exceptionally well read aloud. You know, I always recommend when people are trying to get into Victorian literature, I say try them on audiobook. And like, if you're struggling with Dickens because his sentence structure is weird, try him on audiobook. He works so well read aloud. I love listening to 19th century literature on audiobook, and I always find that a really valuable experience. And probably, do I prefer listening to 19th century literature than reading it physically? Maybe. It's kind of difficult to know, because I think especially I've got to the point now in my like Victorian literature journey where I've read the majority of the books that are famous enough to have an audiobook. So I'm kind of running out of Victorian audiobooks. Though I'm not running out of Victorian literature to read. There's tons of it that I can read digitally on ebook, but there's fewer audiobooks for me to listen to now. So therefore my audiobook listening of Victorian literature tends to be rereads. So that's a slightly different kettle of fish. But anyway, I was trying to think if there are any books that I have read both physically and on audiobook that I didn't like as much on audiobook, and I can only think of two. And the fact that I can only think of two, I think, is probably quite telling for how much I love listening to stuff on audiobook. So the only two books I can think of that I have read both physically and on audiobook that I liked slightly less when I listened to them on audiobook are Persuasion by Jane Austen and Villette by Charlotte Bronte. I have loved other books by Jane Austen on audiobook. I listen to a lot of Austen on audiobook, and I have loved listening to Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte on audiobook, but Villette and Persuasion didn't quite work as well on audiobook for me. I'm not sure exactly why I had that experience. I wonder if it's partly because they're both like slightly quieter and more introspective books. Maybe that works slightly less well on audiobook, I don't know. I think Villette, it was also especially because within Villette there's quite a lot of dialogue in French, and when you're reading it physically, well, partly I know a little bit of French from GCSE, so like that helps, but also I can use Google Translate on my phone, but when you're listening to an audiobook and the French is like washing over you, like you just get lost, or you have to pause and look it up, and that's a bit of a pain. So that means Villette is a less good audiobook, I would say. And there's also, I can think of one book I read on audiobook where I didn't like the audiobook and I didn't love the book, and I felt that maybe that was to do with the audiobook. And that was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which I read a few years back, and I only listened to it. I haven't read it physically, but I didn't love that book, and I found it a bit stilted, and I kind of wonder if maybe that was the audiobook narrator rather than the writing, because so many people love that book, and maybe I just didn't get on with the style, but sometimes I do wonder if that was the audiobook rather than the book. But those are like really isolated incidences. In general, I feel like I can't think of many things I've listened to where I felt like the audiobook experience detracted from the reading of the book, whereas I can think of so many times where the audiobook experience has enriched my reading experience of a book. I have pulled together a list of like some audiobooks that I think really enriched my reading experience. So some that are rereads, and then some that are books I've only listened to on audiobook. So when it comes to rereads, as I mentioned earlier, I love listening to 19th century literature on audiobook, and I love listening to Charles Dickens on audiobook. I feel like Charles Dickens works perfectly on audiobook. When I reread all of Charles Dickens' novels in publication order for the Mega Dickens Read-Along last year and the year before, I listened to them all on audiobook, and I really, really enjoyed that. I would especially recommend the David Copperfield audiobook narrated by Richard Armitage, the Dombey and Son audiobook narrated by Owen Teale, and the Barnaby Rudge audiobook narrated by Jason Watkins. And I want to especially mention the Barnaby Rudge audiobook narrated by Jason Watkins because when I began the Mega Dickens Read-Along, I had read Barnaby Rudge twice before, and it had always been really far down my like Dickens ranking. I had never loved it. It was always one of my least favourite Dickens, and then I listened to it on audiobook and I loved it. And you know, I think there are multiple reasons why I found Barnaby Rudge much more compelling and much more interesting this time around, but one of them was the audiobook. It was so good, and I feel like a lot of the sort of big, complex crowd scenes in Barnaby Rudge. It's a book about the Gordon riots in the 1780s, and there are a lot of these big crowd scenes. I think when I read it physically, I found them quite disorientating and hard to follow, and I didn't find them that impactful. And then when I listened to it, it just really worked so well. And so if you are reading Barnaby Rudge, I would recommend the audiobook over the physical book. Then a few other classic audiobooks I have loved. There is a wonderful Wuthering Heights audiobook by Patricia Routledge, which I've listened to a lot of times. Wuthering Heights is a book I have read many times physically, many times on audiobook, and I feel like probably I will go on rereading it on audiobook rather than reading it physically, because I just love it on audiobook. It's a novel that works so well on audiobook because the book is meant to be spoken aloud. We have a frame narrative, which is someone writing a diary, and then within that diary he writes down the story that someone has told him verbally. So a lot of the book is Nellie Dean telling a story to Lockwood, so it works perfectly on audiobook. I also love Jane Austen on audiobook, with the exception of Persuasion. I don't know what went wrong there, but I have otherwise loved listening to Jane Austen on audiobook. I really love the Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility audiobooks narrated by Rosamund Pike, and I really love the Mansell Park audiobook narrated by Frances Barber. I think they're wonderful. And Mansell Park actually is another book, a bit like Barnaby Rudge, that I feel is really enriched by the audiobook experience. The first time I read Mansell Park, I didn't love it, and then I reread it a bit later, once physically and then again on audiobook, and listening to Mansell Park on audiobook at university like really enriched my love for the book. I also love the audiobook of Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, narrated by Patience Tomlinson. I have listened to this audiobook several times. The first time I read Wives and Daughters as a teenager, I read it physically, but the 3 or 4 times I've read it since then, I've listened to this audiobook, and I love this audiobook so much. It's so comforting, it's so cozy, it's such a great audiobook, and I just really recommend it. I've also loved listening to the Sherlock Holmes stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, narrated by Stephen Fry. That is a wonderful audiobook. Listening to them on audiobook, that was probably like a half reread for me. I think I'd read some of the novels and quite a few of the short stories, but not all of them. And I just think Stephen Fry is a wonderful audiobook narrator. I also love his audiobooks of the Paddington series, A Bear Called Paddington by Michael Bond, and I think he's narrated a couple of later ones in the series too. He does them so well. And I've also loved listening to Agatha Christie on audiobook. Like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, my Agatha Christie audiobook listening has been like half rereads, half not, and probably by now is less than half rereads, but I have loved rereading and reading Agatha Christie on audiobook, and I would especially recommend, if you like the Poirot books, the Hugh Fraser audiobooks are fantastic. Hugh Fraser is a wonderful narrator, better than David Suchet. So whenever you get to one of the like famous books in the Poirot series, David Suchet has narrated it because he's more famous. But I just think he's not actually as good a narrator as Hugh Fraser. Hugh Fraser is wonderful. I would also recommend the Dan Stevens audiobook of And Then There Were None, which is fantastic and really worth a listen. So those are lots of books that I have reread on audiobook and I would really recommend. But I also wanted to mention some books that I have only listened to on audiobook that I think are really wonderful on audiobook and that I would especially recommend the audiobook of. I'd recommend these books because I love them, but I also would really recommend listening to them because I think they're books that work really well on audiobook for a number of reasons. So the first is The Confessions of Franny Langton by Sarah Collins. This audiobook is narrated by Sarah Collins, the author herself, along with Roy McMillan, and it's such a wonderful audiobook. Sarah Collins does such a good job. I'm so impressed when authors read their own audiobooks because it's not the same skill as writing, and it's fantastic. And it also really works because the book is framed as a confession. It's a historical novel about Franny Langton in the 19th century, and she has been imprisoned for murder, and she tells her life story and how she has come to this point. So that works really well spoken aloud. Another wonderful audiobook read by the author themselves is the audiobook of Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. And Ferdia Lennon narrates the audiobook fantastically. I'm so impressed. Like, he just does such an amazing job, and it's such a great book. This has been one of my favorite books of the year so far. I loved this so much, and I think the audiobook experience is really worth having. Like, I would recommend you read Glorious Exploits, but I would recommend you read the audiobook more than I would recommend you read the physical book because the audiobook is fantastic. One of the interesting things about Glorious Exploits is that it is set in ancient Sicily, but is told in a very Irish voice, full of Irish slang and turns of phrase. And I do think that if you listen to the audiobook and you hear Ferdia Lennon narrate it himself in his Irish accent, that is really valuable. I do think that audiobooks can work especially well for a first-person narrative that is told in a very like voicey way. You know, a novel that has a first person narrator with a really distinctive narrative voice. That's something that can often work really well on audiobook, and that's the case for Glorious Exploits, and it's also the case for Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, which is a wonderful book, wonderful audiobook narrated by James Good. Mr. Loverman is one of those sort of plotless literary fiction novels that is mostly a character study, and the voice of Barry, the main character, the narrative voice and the audiobook voice is so good and it's so rich, and I would really recommend the audiobook. And I don't know if I would have liked this book as much if I had read it physically. I would also really recommend the audiobook of Nervous Conditions by Zitzi Dangarembga, which I listened to last year. The audiobook narrated by Chip Chung is fantastic. And this is another one that works really well on audiobook because it's a first person narration, and it is the main character telling you about her life, and that just works so well on audiobook. I also love an audiobook for a book that plays with form or that has like multiple voices. So I loved the audiobook of News of the Dead by James Robertson, which is a really interesting historical novel that takes place in several different time periods using several different forms. The audiobook is narrated by Sheila Reid, David Monteith and David Rintoul, and it just works so incredibly well. Another book that plays with form and has a wonderful audiobook is And the Mountains Echoed by Khaled Hosseini, which is maybe a novel, but is kind of an interconnected series of short stories, weaving lots of narratives together in a really interesting way. The audiobook has multiple narrators and it works so well. And I also love the audiobook of Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a really fascinating novel, which is told in the form of interview transcripts. It is about the history of a band, and it's told through interviews with the former band members. And the audiobook is a full cast audiobook with a lot of different voices in, and it works so perfectly for Daisy Jones and the Six. It is wonderful. Like, I would always recommend listening to the audiobook over reading the physical book. And then one classic I wanted to mention, I feel like a lot of the classics I've been talking about and the classic audiobooks I've been talking about have been rereads for me. But one book I recently read for the first time on audiobook and loved was The Female Quixote by Charlotte Lennox. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Donna Banya, which was amazing. And I feel like the narrator really brought the humour and the wry tone of The Female Quixote to life. I feel like I enjoyed the book all the more for listening to it on audiobook and for listening to that wonderful audiobook. It was so well done. Then a couple of other books I wanted to mention that I have loved on audiobook, and I don't really know why they work so well on audiobook. I think probably just because of the performances, but I did really love them. So I wanted to mention Emily Henry's novels. I've listened to all 6 of Emily Henry's romance novels on audiobook. I'm pretty sure they're all narrated by the same person, Julia Whelan, who is fantastic. And I would never read an Emily Henry book physically now. I would always listen to them because I love Julia Whelan's narration so much, and because I've just had such a good time listening to all of Emily Henry's books. I feel like the humour and the emotion just come to life in Julia Whelan's narration, and I would really recommend trying Emily Henry's books on audiobook. Another audiobook I loved and had a really wonderful experience listening to was The Whalebone Theatre by Joanna Quinn, narrated by Olivia Vinall. Olivia Vinall is also the person who has read the audiobooks of both of my 2 novels, and I actually listened to The Whalebone Theatre when I had been given some names as some potential audiobook readers by my publisher for The Secrets of Heart O'Toole, and I really liked Olivia Vinall's voice, and I decided I wanted to listen to a full audiobook by her. And I was listening to The Whalebone Theatre being like, oh my goodness, what an amazing audiobook narrator. I'll be so sad if she's not free to read my book. And she was, and she did, and I think she's great. But I really recommend The Whalebone Theatre. It's fantastically read, and it's such a wonderful book. A really interesting World War II novel about a family's life over many years, and it's just great. And the final audiobook I wanted to mention was the audiobook of The Final Strife by Sara El-Arifi, narrated by Nicole Lewis and Dominic Hoffman. I really must continue with the series because I loved The Final Strife. It's probably my favourite fantasy book I've ever read, and I still haven't read its sequel. This was years ago that I read it. I thought it was so good, but I loved it especially because I listened to the audiobook, and I think I'm someone who doesn't read a ton of fantasy, but I always really like it when I do, and I feel like listening to The Final Strife on audiobook made it so much more approachable, made it so much more fun, made the length no longer an issue for me, and I just had such a wonderful reading experience with this incredible work of fantasy. So I would really recommend The Final Strife, and I would really recommend it on audiobook. Okay, I've got to the end of my list of specific audiobooks. I feel like this has been such a long rambly video, but I hope this has been interesting. Hello again, Editing Katie here from the future. So as I was editing this video, I realised that there were 2 things I forgot to mention, and this video is definitely long enough already, but I thought I would quickly mention them here. So one thing I forgot to talk about was I was talking about whether or not I like audiobooks more than physical books, but what I actually meant was, do I like listening to audiobooks more than I like physically reading? I wasn't actually talking about like physical books as objects. And one thing that did occur to me is that very often if I listen to a book on audiobook and really love it, I will buy myself a physical copy. So I do obviously like value having a physical edition of a book on my shelves, even if I listen to it on audiobook. So I do still like love physical books as objects. And even if I've listened to a book on audiobook and my experience of that book was not a physical reading experience, there is still a part of me that wants to own the physical book as a physical object. So maybe that's interesting. And then the other thing I forgot to talk about was like where I listen to audiobooks and where I get audiobooks from. And I was thinking about this as I was editing the video, because I realised that especially when I was talking about like classics audiobooks, there were a lot of like exclusive to Audible stickers on a lot of the covers. So I listen to audiobooks primarily through two apps. I listen to a lot of audiobooks from the Libby app, which is a app that works with local libraries. So I listen to a lot of audiobooks that my local library has on audiobook through Libby. That is probably my like preferred way to listen to audiobooks. I do also listen to audiobooks on Audible, and I don't love using Audible because they are owned by Amazon and they're a massive monopoly. And actually like Audible are a much bigger monopoly of the audiobook market than Amazon are of the book market in the UK. Audible are such a big monopoly in audiobooks, and I don't think that's great. But I have been using Audible for a very, very long time, and they do have a lot of very good classics audiobooks. I don't think I had realised until I was editing this video just how many of the classic audiobooks I have loved are made by Audible, which, you know, like I said, feel complicatedly about, but that is how I do some of my audiobook listing. I do sometimes also use Apple Books for audiobooks, like especially I keep an eye on the audiobooks that are on offer there, and I have occasionally used Kobo as well. I am kind of interested in exploring other apps and other companies to listen to audiobooks through, because as I said, I'm not like super comfortable with using Audible as much as I do. So if you have any recommendations for how you listen to audiobooks, do let me know. And now we will go back to Katie from the past for a conclusion that isn't really a conclusion. I don't know that I really have any conclusions about whether I like listening to audiobooks more than I like reading physically. I think probably I love both for different reasons, and I'm never going to like stop reading physically and just listen to audiobooks, but audiobooks are so much more versatile, and they have become a really important part of my reading life, and I'm really glad about that. And I think maybe for some people listening to audiobooks is like for convenience, but they don't actually love it as much as reading physically, whereas I think I do love listening to audiobooks as much as I love reading physically. But probably not more. I think maybe they're just equal. This has been a real ramble, so do let me know down in the comments. Do you listen to audiobooks? Do you like them? How do you find listening to audiobooks and reading physically different? And what do you like about both, or either, or neither, or whatever it might be? That is all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.